Mayor and Council, Rodney Gonzalez, Assistant City Manager. For the viewing public, so that way they can follow along, the 4 topics that we were going to discuss today are property taxes, reviewing base motion options for the Land Development Code, reviewing the supplemental staff report number 2 that was released last week, and then housing capacity. This morning we did cover property taxes, and to your point, we were going to cover housing capacity. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nick Baudet.
Thanks, Rodney. For the public, this is our ever-growing calendar of where we've been and where we're going with today's work session and tomorrow's work session on the calendar, as well as the public hearing scheduled for this Saturday at 10 a.m., December 7th, here at City Hall, and a few other items on the calendar. So with that, I'm going to fast forward to housing capacity and turn the presentation over to Alex Steinberger from Cascadia Partners.
Hello, council members, mayor. I appreciate you moving things around for me. I do have to go to the airport in a little while, but I think we have plenty of time. So in the spirit of keeping things crystal clear, we want to go through some questions that have come up about the housing capacity analysis. But to start, let's talk about some definitions. So back in May, which seems like a very long time ago for me, you all provided us with some guidance to look at housing capacity and yield of your code. Now, in the varying approaches to do that kind of work, there are kind of 3 things to understand, three definitions. The first is this idea of theoretical entitlements. So this is a way of looking at the code, and it's the most simplistic way to do it, where you look at the maximum density that could be built under the code on each parcel and estimate the code's capacity regardless of what's on the ground today. So what can the code build maximum regardless of the market, regardless of what's on the ground? Now, in my experience, this is not a particularly helpful metric because it's not achievable. Of course, we're not going to scrape everything that exists today in Austin and start over. So it's not the most helpful metric. And that's why you gave us this directive to look at capacity in terms of redevelopment. And so to do that, we use an approach that we're calling feasible capacity. Now this accounts for market forces. It looks at land values, it looks at achievable rents, and tries to make an estimate of how much of that vacant and existing developed land might redevelop in order to get us to capacity. And you gave us a goal of creating a code that allows for 405,000 units of capacity through that analysis. And where we ended up is 397,000, so that's very close. And then we have yield. And yield is actual development that results over time. And to really accurately measure yield, you actually need to go into the future and look back. There's no other way to accurately measure it, but you did set a goal of 135,000 unit yield. So we have our feasible capacity goal of 405,000 and our yield goal, what actually gets built, of 135,000. And I want to talk a little bit about those 2 numbers and why they need to be different. Why does feasible capacity need to be bigger than the yield goal? So the next few slides really deal with those 2 concepts exclusively. So the other piece of this direction was that you directed us to use the Envision Tomorrow tool to measure feasible capacity. So I want to talk just a little bit about that, just a little refresher, because we have touched on this. There's also a memorandum that we produced that's on the LDC revision website that goes through this process. But at a high level, the first step is to identify potentially developable vacant land and potentially redevelopable developed land using a residual land value test. So this uses a real estate pro forma to take into account land values and rents in a given area to see what we think would actually redevelop from a developer's perspective. The second step is to apply reasonable build-out densities to that land. So we're not taking the maximum entitlements and applying it to that land because we know that in many cases that's not actually going to be realistic. Instead, we look at recent development trends and try to establish what is actually a reasonable build-out density that we've seen in the past. The third step is to estimate bonus capacity. So there we take the bonuses proposed within the code, and we apply those to the base capacity to figure out the additional bonus capacity within each zone. And finally, we use modeling done by Echo Northwest to figure out the percentage of that bonus capacity that would potentially come back as income restricted affordable housing. So that's that analysis in a nutshell. There are some limitations though, and I want to start off by saying, and I've said this before, that the city of Austin should be very happy with this process because you're doing more than, in my experience, any other city has. Using available data, using realistic, rational processes to estimate the capacity of your code. But that being said, it's not a crystal ball. We can't see the future. It's, at best, a sketch planning exercise that uses the best available data to produce an estimate. So just want to sort of frame it that way. And it's also most useful as a tool to show how we're moving the needle relative to the current code. So are we adding more units? Are we adding the types of units that we think we need in the right locations? And then another limitation that I've already talked about is that we assume that the build-out densities are going to look like they have in the past relative to the maximum entitled density. That's the best approach we can use. There isn't really a better one, but we think that it does produce a more realistic estimate of what could be built. So talking a bit about capacity versus yield. Why do we need 405,000 units of capacity to produce 135,000 units over 10 years? So one bucket of reasons is housing preference. And within housing preference, we have three categories: cost, product type, and location. And I think all of these are pretty self-evident, but I'll go through each. So housing cost. We heard earlier today that Austin has a shortage of housing. You're supposed to have at least 6 months of supply. Right now, you've had about 2 or 3 months of supply for several years. So that's case in point that housing prices are going up because there aren't enough options for people. And every household is different. They all have different incomes. They can all afford different types of housing. And if you only have enough units exactly to match the number of people, you're going to end up with mismatches where people are having to pay more than they can afford to live in this city, and you're seeing it now. Housing product preference, that one is also pretty self-evident, I think. Not everybody wants to live in a single-family detached home or a townhome or an apartment. Some people need to rent. Some people would prefer to own. So there are variations in product types that we can't account for, but we need a lot of options within our zoned land to produce the variety of units that people are going to end up demanding so that they can match the market adequately. And finally, location. We all know that we have various criteria for choosing where to locate, where we live, where we work, where our kids go to school, where our family lives, just the neighborhoods we tend to prefer, the amenities we prefer. So every neighborhood really needs to step up and do its part to provide adequate housing capacity so that there's enough choice and options for people who want to live in certain parts of the city because of their work or life situation. Other things that may influence the need for more capacity. There are site-specific attributes that impact feasibility. So we've included a lot of units, a lot of properties within capacity that may have issues that we don't know about right now, but that may hamper their development. Things like deed restrictions, the presence of heritage trees on those sites. We've said this before, but an economic recession or a housing market slowdown in the future, that may impact the market assumptions that we've assumed for these sites. Site-specific environmental considerations like storage tanks and other pollution. Requirements imposed by financiers on developers, like providing more parking than they need to within the code. Irregular size and shape of a lot's roadway access, so whether or not it has adequate driveway access or can actually locate driveway onto a road given its proximity to an intersection, on and off-site infrastructure upgrade costs like sewer and water. And then one of the most important ones is property owner willingness to sell or develop. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And this is not an exhaustive list. I mean, there are myriad reasons why a specific property may or may not redevelop. So within that 405,000, you've got to assume that a good portion of them are going to have one or more of these issues. That's why we need to have more capacity than we think we have need for housing. So we were asked by several council members, what are other things that are maybe not being included in the analysis? What are things that we're not accounting for, and why? So one of those things is homeowner preference. And by that, I mean the inability for us to model a homeowner's decision. And I think we can all understand this, right? I mean, as a developer, you have a very simple calculus that you can model. Can I make a profit if I build a building on this piece of land? But as a homeowner, I may not go through that process, and it's very difficult for us to predict or model. And so we want to be conservative. The last thing we want to do is overstate the amount of capacity in the code. That being said, we did look at a couple of these things. For instance, ADUs. The decision on whether or not to build an ADU is a very personal decision. I built an ADU myself, and I can tell you that I didn't necessarily think through all the financial calculus on it. But looking at Austin, you know, in the last 10 years, you've had about less than 2,000 ADUs built, and that's being pretty generous. So in terms of, are we missing a whole bunch of capacity? I don't think that's the case. Call it icing on the cake, call it a windfall. These are little extras, little bits of capacity that may or may not happen, but that will get us hopefully to that 405,000 goal. Other things that we didn't account for, or were unable to account for, were things like a single-family home redeveloping into a duplex. This is, again, a homeowner's decision, and they may not always be thinking rationally in terms of dollars and cents. There could be a family issue there. There could be many reasons why they would want to sell or not want to sell. Again, we looked at the construction of two-family dwellings in Austin, and even if you don't take into account whether those were built on existing developed lots or vacant lots, there have only been about 1,200 built in the last year. So that's, those were all on single-family homes, 10 years, sorry. That's 600 units of capacity. So again, a very small amount of capacity that we may not have accounted for. And then there were some PUDs that were entitled since this process began. Those account for no more than 3,000 units maximum. And then there are also proposed changes to floodplain, such as Atlas 14, that we couldn't account for because they haven't been fully adopted, and the conversation about those started after we began. So when you add it all up, ADUs, duplex redevelopment, PUDs that were entitled since this process began, by our estimation, that's less than 7,000 units total of capacity that were not included in the numbers we showed you previously. So again, if they happen, that's fantastic. It's extra capacity that we desperately need and gets us to that 405,000 unit capacity goal. So I think that's all good. The last thing I want to highlight is that, you know, all of this really gets us to, within the 405,000 unit capacity number, there are a range of sites, from the shovel-ready sites that you could build on tomorrow, maybe they have a willing owner to sell, or maybe they're for sale today, all the way to sites that are challenging, that may have pollution or an unwilling owner, or may have an existing use that still has a usable life. All of those were counted in the 405,000 unit capacity. And what's really important to think about as we go through this process is that these shovel-ready sites, the low-hanging fruit, those are already being developed under the current code. Every day, a site gets developed, and the outcome may not be what we want or need to fix the housing crisis in this city and any number of other issues that we want the code to address. So the longer we don't have a revised LDC, the more of these sites that are more likely to redevelop we end up losing. And in the end, we may be left with sites that are more challenging and less likely to redevelop, which will make it more difficult to reach our goal of 135,000 units. So with that, we'll open it up for questions.
Okay. 325, we have a hard stop. So if everybody could be as direct and as quick to the question as they can do. Ann.
Okay, thank you. On table 2 of your of the report, the October 30th report, there's a listing of the LDCs. I just want to make sure I understand it. So there's a listing of. Sorry, I was trying to be too fast. So there's a listing of properties that are not counted, and those are the I just want to make sure I'm understanding this table correctly. Mm-hmm. So R1, R2A, R2B, R2C, R3, and RR are not counted except for the fact unless they're on vacant land.
That's
Am I
correct.
understanding correctly?
That's correct.
Okay, so there was no factor applied to count some of them. There was just none of them counted.
That's correct.
Okay. And so the question that I had was I would like to have the total amounts here, not and is that what you meant by the 7,000?
So it's part of it. We looked at.
So let me just ask.
Sure.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No,
I was
that's
trying
fine.
Because I did hear what you're saying. I really appreciated that. So I'm just trying to understand if the 7,000 is the total count for these 5 categories.
No, the count for those 5 categories we think would be far less than 7,000 because 7,000 includes things like ADUs.
Okay.
It includes PUDs that were entitled since this process began, and a couple of other things.
But aren't ADUs in R2?
That is true. So ADUs perhaps would be part of that. But again, I mean, we're looking at a very small number.
Well, can you give us the number for each one of these categories that were not counted?
We can't provide a reasonable estimate because it's very difficult to predict a homeowner's willingness to redevelop.
I'm asking for capacity, not for feasible capacity on these.
We don't believe I don't believe that to be a best practice to
I understand
analyze
that.
the code
I
in
understand
that way.
that. And I really, let me just say, I'm not challenging the best practice. I think it's great. I really appreciate y'all using best practice, and I respect your opinion on that and your expertise. I really do. So my questions are not directed at saying you should have done anything else or saying that there was anything wrong with the best practice that you used.
Understood.
I'm just asking, can you supply those numbers?
It would be a relatively meaningless number.
I'm
my
not
opinion.
asking if it's meaningful or not. I'm asking, can you supply those numbers?
It is a fairly simple and straightforward calculation
Okay.
that staff can supply you with.
Okay, I would like to have those numbers. And then I'd like to understand a little bit better what the explanation that you gave us.
Mm-hmm.
So, am I understanding correctly that what you're thinking, what the thought is that there's not a way really to get to feasible capacity on those because it's homeowner preferences? Is that the thinking? Did I understand that correctly?
It's difficult to estimate. It's not possible to estimate redevelopment on those properties because it's not a rational developer decision.
Okay. So does that mean, so in your model, that would mean there's not in a best practice model like y'all have, there's not a factor you can apply or anything like that?
It would be, we would not know what number to apply.
Okay.
There is not a factor that exists that we could look at.
Okay.
But we do believe that based on previous trends that we discussed just now,
Yeah.
that the number would be very small, on the
Okay.
order of maybe a few thousand units.
Okay. Previous trends, can you supply us with that information, what previous trends you're
Certainly.
talking about?
Yeah. It's building permit data that was pulled for the city of
Okay.
Austin.
Yeah, that would be great to have that information
Sure.
too. So, okay.
Okay. Is anybody else? Let's just circle back. We'll come back to you.
I am going to be leaving in about 10 minutes, so
Okay.
I guess if that's all I get, that's all I get.
Okay. To give other people a chance to ask a capacity question. Anybody else have any? If we don't, I'll come right back to you.
On capacity? Are we sticking with capacity?
Sticking
or?
with capacity.
So I think I want to be sure I understand, and I did submit some questions that I think are in line with what Councilmember Kitchen asked, and I would just ask that if we could get those answers. I know it says in the Q&A that they're going to be answered here, but I don't think we'll have time to really delve into them. So as I understand your answers to Councilmember Kitchen, there is not, you've not made a capacity calculation. Your capacity calculations of the nearly 400,000 do not take into account R1, R2A, R2B, R2C, R3, and RR.
Unless on
they're
vacant
vacant,
land.
which in many cases they won't be. So I think one thing I just want to highlight and maybe not delve into right now is that, that capacity number was set with the intent of getting the yield of whatever it was, 147. And as I understand the answers that we've gotten back today and through the Q&A, it sounds like that 397 isn't really total capacity that's been mapped. It's actually sort of it builds into it assumptions about how much of that capacity that's been mapped would actually redevelop. And so it seems to me that we're taking, that there's a universe of properties that have been mapped for increased density. And then out of that, you've done some calculations and factored out what you think would be likely to redevelop to get that 397, all with the intent of trying to yield that number of 147,000. And so I would just point that out, that's just, if what we're trying to achieve is the 147, we've mapped far more than 397,000, it would seem. You've mapped the capacity for more than 397,000 units. You just don't think that they will all redevelop necessarily.
We do not believe that those other units you speak of could produce additional capacity. The 397,000 number is our best estimate of what the code could actually produce within 10 years. Those other units that have been zoned, we do not believe that they will change in any significant way in terms of capacity. So
But
to produce
I'm sorry.
to produce a number that's what we refer to as the theoretical entitlement, it's nothing more than theoretical. It's not realistic, and it's not a way to create policy. And many other cities have looked at this matter and have chosen to go a different route, including Seattle, including Portland. Seattle, by the way, went with the same capacity number relative to their planning target 3 times. So by happenstance, you're on the right track, in my opinion.
I think, though, that, and I think there may be a question in the Q&A for it, I would like to know what that theoretical capacity is. I think if we're going to focus so much on producing the number of units and making sure that we have mapping for a certain number of units and et cetera, I want to know what that total universe is. And so there are some other questions I'll just call your attention to. We just wanted to know whether there were certain planned unit developments that were or were not included. I know I've gotten some of that information, but it would be helpful to just get it all, but not necessarily in this setting. It's question 74.
Sure. So the Grove was one, and that was about 1,500 units. Austin Oaks was another, and that was about 425 units. And then Robinson Ranch was not included because we do not think it's realistic to assume that that entire PUD will develop over 10 years.
And again, in consideration for the time constraints, especially of Councilmember Kitchen, I'd just like to get that information, if we could, in writing so that we can peruse it. Thank you.
Certainly.
Greg, and then Leslie.
Yeah, I went back and looked at the manager's memo back from earlier this year, where one of the questions, I believe, was how much housing capacity did we want to yield? And the definition of housing capacity in that memo, where the question was asked, is the same one that we have here under feasible capacity. And so my understanding of our vote, when we asked for 3 times the capacity, was not that we wanted to increase theoretical entitlements by 3 times, but that we wanted to increase feasible capacity by 3 times in order to get to the yield. And so while I'm open to hearing about theoretical entitlements, my understanding is that doesn't actually get us more housing units. The Austonian is 56 floors tall. If we zoned it for 10 more floors, that doesn't get us any new capacity because nobody's tearing the Austonian down to make it 66 floors. And so when we voted in May to go to increase the capacity to 3 times our yield, I wasn't interested in voting on adding theoretical entitlements, but actual capacity. So to me, it makes a lot of sense that we would ask for the actual capacity number to be 3x yield, not the theoretical number. The theoretical number could be a 10x or a 100x or a million x. It doesn't actually change anything unless it's the actual capacity number. So it makes sense to me why that's best practice.
Leslie?
And then the second issue is on ADUs. Of course, we want to get to more ADUs, and I think that's a good thing. I understand that there is a bit of our capacity could be undercounted somewhat if we aren't counting all of the ADU and duplex construction, but then you've also noted that we might be overcounting because you can't know and analyze all the deed restrictions and all the heritage trees and all of the irregular site shapes and sizes. So there might have been a little bit of an undercount on ADUs. There might be a little bit of an overcount on deed restrictions and a little bit of an overcount on irregular sites. In the end, it makes sense to me, and when I talk to other cities, that we are doing this more precisely and more thoroughly than any other city that I've been able to talk to, and I think you're confirming that today, that it's pretty close, understanding that there's going to be some things that make it an undercount and some small things that make it an overcount. But if it's 3,000 or 4,000, when we're talking about 400,000, I think this just shows that we're headed in the right direction to make sure there's enough housing supply to address those issues. So I'm comfortable on those two parts of the analysis.
Leslie?
Thanks. So I just wanted to make sure everybody remembers that figure, the 135,000, that was what was in the strategic housing blueprint. So the 397 wasn't that goal. That was something that was in the guidance document that this body voted on, and I guess it was a less than unanimous vote. There were a significant number of us around the dais that didn't agree with elements in that guidance document, and that's what we're seeing playing out here, and that's why we are asking these questions, because the answers matter. And so to that end, I appreciate, Alex, you're talking about the yield and the capacity and how you are deferring to our city staff to provide the numbers that Councilmember Kitchen has asked for. Did I hear that properly?
I believe the ask was for a specific set of zones, but yes.
So let me bring Ann back into this conversation if I can. Can you repeat back the question that you were asking that came back with the answer about who would give us, that we would actually get the full number for the capacity, not just the yield?
Yeah, I think that the question I asked for was, and like I said before, I understand and respect, and not, not questioning your expertise or your thinking about best practice, but I would like to have that number. And one of the reasons for that is because, I respect what you said, Councilmember Kassar, but, we all had different perspectives and we were compromising. And I was thinking more in terms of what you just said, that you were doing your best to get us something that wasn't theoretical, something that was close to what we might actually get, which in my mind at that time I understood actually to be yield, not capacity. And my understanding at that time was that capacity was something that you needed more capacity so you would get yield. So I'm glad we've done it this way. I think it's a good thing to do. And my only point is, I think we've got a lot of potential here, and maybe there's some room for understanding that could even be a little over the line, because what I'm seeing is a comparison of feasible capacity, which I understand to be closer to yield, to what I thought was setting capacity as a 3 times, not feasible capacity. But we all probably felt something differently at the time. So I'm not here challenging or asking why y'all did that. I'm just saying that, to my mind, it looks more like we're comparing feasible capacity, which is close to yield, to a different target,
Okay.
which was capacity.
Can I just offer one quick clarification? I want to clarify that what you're asking for is not simply a different version or different take on capacity. It's not capacity. It's theoretical entitlements. And so just so if these numbers are produced by staff, just understanding that these are not comparable estimates, they're not even in the same universe. One is entitlements theoretically allowed by the code, and the other is what could be built.
Okay.
reasonably.
So, well, he just.
But we're going to run out of time, and a lot of people aren't going to get a chance to even ask a question about capacity. I think you've made the point that you don't necessarily buy how he's setting it up, and I think that you've asked for the information data, and I think you're entitled to get it. You said that's something that staff can do, and I think that they can do that, and then we can argue about what it means.
And so just to finish up,
Okay, you just
I
have a
wanted-
few more seconds.
well, we don't have agreement yet from our staff that they will bring us those numbers, and we also don't know when to expect it. So in order to close the data loop on what we may be looking at is more capacity and more potential than we ever thought possible. And I think that's terrific too. So who will be bringing us those numbers, and when will we see that?
So, Anik Baudet, I want to first say that tomorrow at work session, we will be going through the second supplemental staff recommendation that talks about changes to the mapping, where we're pulling back on transition areas that are primarily residential in nature, and also making some changes to the application of missing middle zones in areas in early stages of gentrification and displacement. So there's going to be a new number generated from Mr. Steinberger's process that we can provide to y'all, and then from there we'll be happy to do the theoretical number if you'd like.
Well, we have been asking for that for quite some time. So yes, definitely, if you could bring that to us tomorrow, and then also the revised number after we...
I don't know if we can do that tomorrow. Did I say tomorrow? We're not doing the capacity analysis tomorrow. We'll be talking about explaining the new staff recommendation with regards to applying the zones to the map, which will be different and will affect the capacity, the feasible capacity number that was described in the presentation.
Okay, so I'm just back to when can we expect to see that information?
So we have not talked with the consultant about a date for that run yet.
Okay.
But the
and it would also
consultant,
be helpful-
I don't want to be argumentative, but
Before you
Alex passed the baton over to staff to get us those numbers, but you're passing the baton back to him to get you the numbers. So I just want to be clear who has the baton and who is going to hand it off to the council and when.
We'll look into when we can do the theoretical number, but Alex will be providing the feasible number at a later date in the process.
So I'd also like to know
Not the
at what effort it's going to take to be able to get that back.
And that's what we need to look
And,
into.
You know, from where I sit, it's not a relevant number. But I understand that some of the council members want to see that number. If it's going to take a lot of time to be able to get that number, then probably as a council we need to discuss whether or not that's where we want the resources
Well,
spent.
isn't that number the
it's a
basis from
number
which
that's
he was
easy to
able
come
to
out-
achieve the number that he gave us, the 395?
No.
No.
So if you could come back, just what I understood, that would be it's a pretty straightforward thing to do. If it's the case and we can get that number, I think that'd be great. If it's going to take a significant investment of time or resources, come back and tell us what that is so that the council can give you direction on it.
Mr. Mayor, can I say one last thing,
Yes.
please? I mean, we all are respecting each other's opinion, and we're also trying not to relitigate or what we did in May. So, but we all came away from May with certain compromises, and so I think requesting this information, even though some of you may not think it's relevant, I think is important information, and I would like to have it. And I can't imagine that it would take that much to do it. So
And to
if I
reiterate
thought
what I
it,
said, I understood that it wasn't going to take that much to get it back, and I think that if that's the case, then we definitely need to get that information because people have requested it. If that's not true and it's going to take a lot of time, then give us a chance to talk about it. Paige.
I agree that could be some difficult information to track down, and if it's not too much trouble, I would like to piggyback with what our current land development code has as theoretical entitlements or feasible entitlements compared to the actual housing that we are seeing. Because I know that there are places where we're not fully maximized, and I anticipate that would move forward in an updated code as well. So I think if we're going to try to compare things, we should have some sort of basis of reality of what could be built if everything was maximized under current code, so we can compare it. If we're not getting full yield now, the idea with 405 was to get to our goal. So we overshot it knowing we're not going to fully maximize. And I'm just wondering how that compares to current development. Does that make
It makes complete sense.
Does that
You
make
may
it-
recall last time we talked about how your current code has over 4,000 unique combinations of base zones, conditional overlays, NCCDs, ABCD, LMNOP. And so it's fundamentally impossible to accurately model it because it is so broken. So the best attempt we were able to make was using the same approach that we've used for this round of modeling, what we call nearest equivalency. But again, that's not comparable to the theoretical capacity that's been requested because, again, it looks at feasibility. It would be quite a bit more work, and at the end of the day would not produce a comparable number, I fear.
Okay, so you'll come back with what that estimate of time is, so we can talk about it. Okay, Allison.
Thank you, and I want to thank you for the time that you spent with me and my staff diving into the capacity numbers. There's one piece that I would like some further clarification on. So you mentioned there are about 3,000 units of PUDs that were not counted. Can we get the names and the numbers for those PUDs that were not counted? My district, for instance, has a lot of PUDs, and I'm trying to understand what was counted in the capacity or not. And some of those are at differing states of viability, and so it's important for me to understand those numbers.
Yeah, go ahead, Tamika.
Yeah, so the best that we could tell from Alex's analysis is that it was the Grove and Austin Oaks that were not included. And I believe Austin Oaks is 425 units and the Grove is under 1,500 units, approximately 1,500. So those were not included in the analysis. But as far as partially built out, I think you could answer this, Alex, but the PUDs that you did include, you included the maximum number that they could build under.
That's generally correct, yes.
So that is the answer. It's Austin Oaks and the Grove, and Robinson Ranch was also not included, and that was a decision that was made early on in the previous work in that process.
Okay, and then on Robinson Ranch with the Apple's decision, do we have? I don't know what else has been agreed to besides the Apple location. Are they building?
I'm not aware of any other. I mean, in working with development services, I know that McNeil High School has gone in, Apple's gone in, but I'm not aware of any other applications in the Robinson Ranch area in the last year.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Jimmy.
That's right on Robinson Ranch, and my understanding is they're trying to master plan the entire site, but it will have a very long tail development cycle, and as long as it will take to build out Apple, you won't see very much on the ground in Robinson. As much as what I'm understanding, they want to do mixed use and they want to do housing. It's a long tail development process out there. Thank you, Councilmember Ellis, for your point about theoretical entitlement. I was thinking exactly the same thing. Sorry, I stole your crib notes on that. I do have concerns about pulling numbers out of context and distributing those without context in the community. We all know what that number will be used for. We know how it will get put on social media. We know how it will be used by political action committees. And I don't think that's what we want to do. If we were going to have that number in comparison to the current code, where there was an analysis of theoretical entitlement capacity and yield historically, but it doesn't sound like that's a really actual analysis you can do because the code is so broken, you can't actually get to those numbers. So I don't want the staff to be distracted with that work because I don't think it's useful, and I don't think it actually aids in our policymaking decision. In fact, I worry that it will distract this conversation in the public. What I'm excited about is that we're going to get more housing, and whether or not it's 120,000 units over 10 years or 140,000 units over 10 years or 160,000 units over 10 years, it's housing we need in the fastest growing city, in historic unemployment, in historic growth, and new jobs coming, and all the rest. And the other piece of this that we don't ever talk about is commercial capacity, because at the same time that we're talking about housing, we're also talking about our small business owners who are having a problem keeping their doors open. And we've never asked for, and I am not asking for, an analysis of leasable square feet that now becomes available, or what we think that would turn into. I'm really hopeful that I see sites that are currently strip malls turn into mixed use. But I don't know how likely that is. And that's a lot of the capacity of my district along the highways, where you've got these acres of parking that were not full last Friday on Black Friday. They were not full. But we're not asking for that type of analysis either. So I really want to pump the brakes on some of this, just so that we can, just for numbers that I don't think are going to be helpful.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation on capacity. Let's pause for a second on that. Let's go to the